Hi everyone, welcome to the latest edition of Realistic Business Forecasting. I realise it's been quite a while since I actually did a podcast, but that's because I've been away. I've actually been working on a project in the city of Surabaya in Indonesia. And I'd like to show you some of the problems and issues I've come across in my role as being responsible for forecasting demand for a project there. And the project in question is a bus rapid transit system. Now, let me just explain a little bit about how transport works in Surabaya. There are quite a lot of stakeholders involved, even on the operations side. There is a citywide bus company which runs large buses and smaller minibuses. There is a nationally sponsored service which runs large buses, and there are several independent operators who operate small buses. Again, they're relatively old and not in great condition compared to the minibuses operated by the city authority. Now, a bus rapid transit system is clearly not cheap. And to make it viable, you need a good number of passengers. I don't think that will come as any surprise to anybody. So what we're actually offering here is what I call a transformational project. In other words, what is happening currently bears relatively little relationship to what we hope will happen in future. And at present, from what we can determine, the usage of public transport in Surabaya is very low. On average, each person makes only around 5 or 6 public transport trips per annum on average, and that is a very low figure indeed. To give you a bit of context, in the city of Manchester in the UK, which has a population not too different from Surabaya, the number of public transport trips per annum on average is 80. So we're talking about a completely different order of magnitude. Now, granted, Manchester does have its very good Metrolink system, it has a good number of heavy rail services, and it has a comprehensive bus network. There is some heavy rail in Surabaya, but it's not used a great deal. So the majority of services are undertaken by bus. So the question is, how does one forecast future demand? Well, there are 2 ways to do it. There's top-down and bottom-up. What I mean by top-down is we can look at other cities around the world, including Manchester, and say, right, with a good quality bus rapid transit system, we would expect so many trips per person per annum, assuming that the system was well operated, well promoted, and the fares were considered to be value for money. The other option, which is the one which is commonly used, is to start with current demand. But current demand is really, really low. So what do you think? On one hand, a bottom-up forecast is based on fact, i.e., the current level of demand for bus services, but a top-down approach does seem to be more realistic. I'd be interested to know your thoughts about this. Now, 2 big differences between Southeast Asia and Europe, for example, are what I call the carrot and stick approach and cultural differences. And let's start with carrot and stick, because carrot and stick issues are short term. And let me explain what I mean by that. As well as trying to promote public transport, the likes of Manchester, for example, and it applies to plenty of other cities, applies several sticks. For example, it can be expensive to park or difficult, there aren't sufficient spaces, or petrol taxes are high, Or in the case of London, there is a congestion charge. If you go into the centre of the city between certain hours, you have to pay a fee or a fine, depending on your point of view. So that's what I mean by sticks. And I would argue that to actually develop demand for public transport, you not only have to try and increase the number of people using buses, trains, etc., you also have to try and reduce demand for private transport. And you can't, I don't think you can do one without the other. Because whilst private transport, remains cheap, people will not have a real incentive to use public transport. Let me give you an example. One of my colleagues in Indonesia told me that he wouldn't dream of using the bus in Surabaya because for not a great deal more, he was able to get a motorbike taxi. And yes, it cost him a bit more, but the motorbike taxi was still very cheap for him, and incomes in Surabaya are not that low. I mean, yes, they're low by Western European standards, but they're much higher than, say, a good deal of the developing world. In fact, Indonesia is classed as a middle-income country. So how does one model in a forecast the use of sticks as well as carrots? And even modeling carrots can be difficult. There's a challenge of trying to model an efficient marketing operation, for example. And if you actually look around and you type Google searches on public transport in Surabaya, it will become evident quite clearly that there isn't a great deal of promotion going on for the public transport services. And the third issue, which is a longer term matter, is culture, which is related to the carrots and stick approach. Because many of us have grown up with the messages, let's say, from government and other organizations that motoring is expensive, it is polluting, bad for the environment. A lot of us now instinctively would think of using public transport to go into a city centre or to take trips in general where that option is available. In other parts of the world, use of public transport is very much a mode of last resort. So as in addition to the carrots and sticks in the short term, those feed into a longer term need for a cultural change to make people realize that public transport does have benefits, not just to them, but also to the environment. Don't forget, this is something which in Western Europe we are now so used to, we probably don't give it a second thought. It's quite a different mindset in many other parts of the world. So again, the challenge once again, how does one model and the necessity to change culture? It's certainly not easy, and it can be done in a crude way. For example, having a dummy variable, which I'll come to in a future podcast. 1 is cultural change, 0 is no cultural change, but it's very crude. But nonetheless, just assuming that demand will grow exponentially because you have a new modern transport system in place, I don't think really works. Because as well as needing promotion to make people aware of the changes and to segment the market and target different markets with appropriate offers, you also need to encourage people, or I should say encourage people, to get out of their cars or off their motorbikes and onto public transport. And that requires a political will as well. Let me give you an example. I was just reading just yesterday in my for my home island of Lanzarote, there is a private water supplier. And the contract called for annual price increases, but our tariffs have not gone up since 2011. So that might sound great superficially, but what are the impacts of that? There's been far less money available for investment. The water supply system is creaking, is falling into disrepair, and there's going to have to be a big price increase at some point. to actually pay for all the investment needed. Oh, and also over 50% of the water produced is leaked, which is quite shocking. Now, why there were no price increases? Because politicians were allegedly frightened of upsetting voters. And yet it's a bit like King Canute trying to control the tides. It can't happen. At some point, the dam has got to burst and prices have got to catch up, unless a government wants to subsidize ad infinitum a particular service with money which they probably don't have. So a political will is needed as well to not only to impose sticks, but also to try and develop cultural change. Anyway, I just thought I'd share some of those issues which I came across on my trip to Indonesia. I'll probably do another podcast on one of my favorite subjects, which is airport access, which is quite an important issue in Surabaya because Surabaya has one of the world's busiest single runway airports, but very little in the way of public transport services serving it. But that is an issue for another podcast and another day. So I hope you found this podcast of interest. Thanks and goodbye.